Welcome, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you all for joining us. We're very grateful. We could have a very nice turnout this evening. And my name is Andrea. I'll introduce myself. I'm president of the Alumni Association, and this event is being coordinated and organized by the Alumni Association with the grateful assistance of the Advancement Office. So we have a wonderful speaker here tonight. And what I will do is I will start us off with a land acknowledgement. Then I will introduce our speaker, Jen, and she will get started with her talk for us this evening. So once again, welcome, welcome. It's our first event actually for the 24-25 season. And so we're happy to see such a great turnout. I wish to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been and continues to be the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, Haudenosaunee, Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, this location is still the home of many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and it is still the home of many diverse First Nation, Inuit, and Métis people. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit River. We're grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. We all have a responsibility to be active players in the decolonization of which we're currently enacting by learning, showing up, speaking up, and staying informed about the needs and desires of our Indigenous comrades. I must acknowledge people like myself who were brought across the Atlantic without being given a choice, people who were brought on the transatlantic trade ship, human trade ship. We all must recognize other nations who came to this land by choice through colonialism, of which some forgot that they are settlers. We give thanks to our Indigenous ancestors for their patience, but acknowledge that it has been exploited. If we could take a moment, I imagine all of us are aware of whose land we currently sit, as we're all in different places this evening. If we could take a moment and reflect on that reality. Thank you. My acknowledgement is not performative, and it reflects my commitment and readiness to stand beside our Indigenous comrades towards their reclamation. Thank you. I'm very grateful as people are coming in one by one. But I'd like to introduce our speaker, as she has a full program for us this evening. Jenn Shields is a therapist, EMDR consultant, and founder of Full Potential Therapy. Her area of focus includes emotional regulation, trauma processing, and relationship improvement using the techniques from ego state therapy, hypnosis, yoga, and EMDR. She's a graduate of the University of Toronto Factor-Inwentash Faculty of Social Work, and we're very grateful to call her an alumni. I'd like to turn the microphone over to Jen as she will now conduct her session. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me here today. If at any point you can't hear me well or see me, just let me know, but I think we're good to go. Thank you, Andrea, for the introduction. I do have a full program for us. I've got a PowerPoint presentation that I'm gonna share with you. So if you give me a minute to get set up here, there we go. So I will give it a start. Okay. Give me 1 second, please. Okay. Okay. So, welcome to Clinical Conversations Discovering the Unseen, a workshop on hidden trauma and the trauma of omission. Thank you so much to the Factor-Inwentash Faculty of Social Work for hosting and continuing to engage alumni and friends in the community. So just a few housekeeping pieces before we dive in. So we're meeting today until 8 p.m. I see some folks have their camera on, and you are more than welcome to turn it on, give a wave, stay engaged. It's really lovely to see some faces. So if there's anything I'm saying and you're looking at me with puzzlement, I'll know to elaborate or say something in a different way. So thank you so much. Your participation is welcomed and encouraged. That's why I called it Clinical Conversations. I would love if you stayed engaged or asked questions at any point. However, I do ask that we do this through the chat function. So if you look at the bottom of your screen, I'm going to type in hello. We can communicate through the chat function there. A reminder that everyone can see your messages, and even if you're sending a message to me privately, I am going to sift through and read it out loud. So please don't share anything in the chat that you wouldn't want shared with a larger group. Again, microphones are turned off, please, to limit interruptions. And we will be sending out the slides after this presentation, and the recording will be made available on the faculty's YouTube. So stay tuned. If you're signed up, you'll get that via your email. I'll also be sharing a list of resources at the end of our session, so you can do some further reading or research if the topic that we're talking about interests you. Okay, so what are our objectives today? I'm going to make my screen. Can you still see my screen? Yeah, okay, perfect. So our objectives today are to foster connection by coming together in community to share and explore ideas, to cultivate curiosity and enthusiasm about conceptualizing and supporting positive mental health. Okay. To provide a clear definition and overview of the trauma of omission, to examine core emotional and psychological needs of children framed through the lens of attachment research, to explore the long-term impact of childhood experiences and the trauma of omission on adult mental health. And we'll also be discussing cultural factors that contribute to the prevalence of trauma of omission, focusing on societal influences on parenting. And the reason we want to do that is to shift away from parent blaming. And we're going to be meeting again on February 10th to talk about the therapeutic approaches to respond to the phenomenon that we're going to be talking about today. So to put it more plainly, we're going to be talking about three major buckets today. The first piece is we'll be outlining what the trauma of omission is in childhood. The second bucket is we'll be discussing the impact of the trauma of omission on adult mental health. And then the third piece is we'll be normalizing why the trauma of omission is so common, and also providing some hopefulness around if this is something that folks have experienced, there are ways that we can grow and heal, but it can be something that we're mindful of. So the third piece is normalizing and sharing pathways for healing, which we'll be elaborating on February 10th. Okay. Next slide. So who am I? Thank you so much, Andrea, for that wonderful introduction. I am a therapist in private practice, and I provide remote-based therapy to adults, adolescents, and couples across Ontario and in person in Leslieville. So I'm the founder of Full Potential Therapy. We're a group of clinicians that practice from the framework that we'll be talking about in this lecture. And I just want to shout out my colleague, Brooke, in that picture there. She went over my presentation with me and has shared some wonderful feedback that I'll be peppering in throughout. So thank you so much to Brooke. I also do corporate and organizational mental health workshops. So we might have seen each other in the past through lectures or webinars or workshops. Please feel free to stay in touch, and I'll offer ways that we can do that at the end of this lecture. So just give me one sec. I'm going to make my screen, if it's okay with everyone, I'm going to present like this because I can see my screen a little bit better and hopefully it doesn't bug people too much to see the side panel there. So I wanted to take a moment and just check in about where is everyone joining us from today. So I'm joining from Toronto. Specifically, I'm in the East End where I have my practice, but are folks joining us internationally? Okay, so we've got Toronto, Winnipeg. Last time we did this lecture in 2022. We had folks from Europe even joining us, so I appreciated them staying up very late. Okay, so Hamilton, West End, Mississauga, California. That's wonderful. Okay, awesome. So we'll let those continue to stream in. And I'm curious if there's any graduates from the University of Toronto, and if so, what year? I'm a social worker alumni from the faculty, and I'm curious, are there any alumni that are joining? Oh, MSW, wonderful. Awesome. Okay, so some MSW graduates, I know we have. Wonderful. And I'm curious if people want to pop in the chat, what drew you to this webinar? Why are you here? Are you familiar with the trauma of omission, and what are you most interested in learning about today? So if you want to stream those questions into the chat, it's really curious for me to just have a look at what brought you in today. Okay. Okay. Okay, I'm gonna check in on these messages. Okay, so some folks are in the field, in private practice. Okay, so a lot of folks are joining us as clinicians, but we also have folks in adjacent disciplines, working in child protection, hospital. Wonderful. I want to extend a message to you to take care of yourself throughout our presentation. So this is really important from the faculty and I, just knowing that we will be making reference to some experiences that can be distressing, especially when we're talking about experiences that can be distressing for children and their well-being. So if you, as we explore these topics, if you find yourself, reflecting on your own childhood experiences or noticing what must have been missing, because this trauma is quite pervasive, it's natural for this conversation to bring up emotions. However, if at any point you feel overwhelmed or triggered or need to take a step back, please honor these feelings and care for yourself. So this might include taking a break, stepping away from the discussion, reaching out for some support. So at the end of our time together, I'll offer some resources, and also feel free to reach out. I don't provide crisis services. However, I'm happy to respond to emails within a timely manner. So your well-being is really important, and it's okay to pause if you need to. Okay, and thanks again, everyone, for popping into the chat. It's so lovely to hear about the diverse experiences folks are bringing in. Okay, so you're at a webinar about the trauma of omission. Let's chat a bit about what the trauma of omission is. So in order to understand what the trauma of omission is, we're going to first define trauma. So trauma refers to a deeply distressing experience that overwhelms an individual's ability to cope. Trauma is individual, and this is important to stress. It's not what happened to someone, but what happens inside of someone as a result. In that way, trauma is subjective and is specific person to person and how that individual processes the experience. So trauma is something that overwhelms an individual's ability to cope. When someone is unable to cope, they often develop strategies known as coping mechanisms to manage the emotional pain or distress. These coping mechanisms might include suppressing emotions to avoid feeling pain, avoiding reminders of the distressing experience, or changing their view of themselves or the world to adapt and survive. So this is particularly true for children who are so resilient and who have so many ways of coping when things are difficult. Now, Children can't just leave their families, right? They can't say, I want to go live with the neighbors next door, right? So sometimes when kids are in situations that are less than ideal, they will really creatively adapt by engaging in coping mechanisms that are really adaptive in childhood. However, later on in life can become less relevant to well-being. But because they're so deeply ingrained, it's hard to shift them without recognition that, hey, this is an old coping mechanism. If that doesn't make so much sense yet, I promise it will as we move on. So, the trauma of omission occurs when critical emotional needs are neglected during key developmental stages, particularly in childhood and adolescence. Unlike overt trauma, like abuse, omission is more subtle and involves a lack of essential experiences. So many people come to therapy and they don't conceptualize emotional neglect as traumatic, yet sometimes folks still struggle with the impact. Trauma's impact can be subconscious. So oftentimes, let's say you put your hand on a stove. Your brain works in the background to tell you to pull your hand away. You don't have to consciously think about, my hand hurts, I'm going to move it away now. It's something that happens really quickly and automatically. When trauma occurs, the brain captures vivid snapshots of the sensory experiences surrounding the event. What you see, hear, smell, feel, and touch. These sensory impressions become strongly tied to the trauma, creating powerful memory triggers that can resurface unexpectedly. So I'll give you a really straightforward example. Let's say somebody's in a car accident. When they hear screeching tires or smell burning rubber, that it can trigger intense panic because the brain subconsciously links these sensory details to a traumatic event. So even being in the car, even though it's safe enough now, can remind somebody of that time I was in a car and it wasn't actually safe. For someone who experienced emotional neglect, a different type of trauma, something later on in life, like a partner's distracted behavior or emotional unavailability, could evoke overwhelming feelings that are old and that are stored from childhood. So, subconsciously, the brain can associate relational cues like silence during conflict or a lack of eye contact with the pain of earlier trauma. These triggers can cause intense emotional reactions, even in situations that are unrelated or objectively safe enough today. So if you've had an overwhelming response to something, you might wonder about, is this response relevant to the situation at hand, or are there elements that could be old and it's reminding me of something else? So we'll be defining the essential childhood experiences that contribute to positive mental health outcomes later on in life. And I want to stress something here. So the key word is contribute. We can't say that if something happens, then this will be the outcome, right? If you did your Master of Social Work at the faculty, we know causation and correlation, right? This trauma of omission doesn't cause mental health challenges later on in life, but there is a correlation. So we can say childhood experiences play a pivotal role in shaping mental health and well-being later on in life. That's the research we'll be showing. While no single factor guarantees positive outcomes, certain experiences contribute significantly by fostering resilience, emotional regulation, and secure attachment relationships. So the 5 S's are one of my most favorite way of conceptualizing how to meet childhood needs. So are people familiar with The Whole Brain Child by Dr. Daniel Siegel, or more broadly, Dr. Daniel Siegel's work? He is a child psychiatrist located in California, I believe, and he conceptualizes the 5 S's that we're going to go over, and I find them just such a beautiful way of outlining developmental needs. So, the first developmental need that Dr. Siegel outlines is to be seen. So, to be seen is to be truly known and understood by caregivers. So, to be physically seen. I see you stacking those blocks so high, right? Children love playing peekaboo or hide and go seek, just like this adorable little one in the photo, right? You can't see me, now you see me. So, physically seen is one piece, but also kids and adults long to also be emotionally seen, to be known and understood. We want our thoughts, our emotions, our experiences to be seen and known. So, not only I see you stacking those blocks, but you look so sad that those blocks fell over. You worked so hard on that tower. In order to have this need be met, caregivers must practice the essential skill of curiosity, pausing to observe a child's behavior and expressions, asking open-ended questions to understand the why. So at first, we give our kids the language to understand their internal experiences. You're upset because, right? And we give them the language. You're upset because you worked so hard, right? And later on in life, we say, you're upset because you worked so hard. Did I get that right? And it could be, no, actually, caregiver, you didn't get that right. I'm upset because this. Okay. Being seen reassures us that we matter. When others acknowledge our emotions, experiences, and individuality, it validates our existence and fosters a sense of belonging. Without this recognition, people may feel invisible, leading to isolation and diminished self-worth, right? We know if you've ever been ignored that it's the most distressing thing we can do to another human. Feeling seen strengthens connection, affirms our place in relationships, families, and community. So even seeing folks' faces, right, on the Zoom can feel like I see you. Andrea was so kind to offer the folks that we saw a hello. It makes us feel like, oh, I matter. And that's really important to do in attachment relationships. So when someone sees and acknowledges our emotions, it helps us process and regulate them. This is especially critical in childhood, where caregivers' ability to attune to a child's emotional needs fosters secure attachment. And we'll be talking about that a little bit later on. Okay, seen. The second piece is safe. We want to foster an emotionally safe environment which allows children to express their emotions, thoughts, and vulnerabilities without fear of judgment, rejection, or harm. So safety involves shielding children from frightening or overwhelming behaviors of the people around them, right? And that's indirect trauma. Even if a little one is in the environment of chaos, that little person might not feel emotionally safe. Responding consistently with nurturing care and accepting all emotions without shaming or criticizing. Emotional safety also means redirecting inappropriate behaviors calmly, showing children that mistakes are opportunities for learning, not fear. So in this space, children feel free to explore their inner world, what's inside, and also their outer world. So we've gone through seen, safe, soothed. Soothed means that a caregiver can help a child manage distress by providing comfort, empathy, and co-regulation during challenging times. It teaches children they are not alone in their struggles. Soothing experiences teach children that their feelings are manageable and that they are not alone in their struggles. Over time, this co-regulation helps them develop the skills to self-soothe and build emotional resilience. One thing that I can share with you is that there is no self-regulation without first co-regulation. If there are any parents on the call, we know this. Kids have no idea how to self-regulate. We literally have to teach them. And my favorite line from one of my brilliant supervisors was, kids are born not knowing whether they're a human or a lamp. Like we literally have to teach them everything through the way that we interact with them. So soothing can include physical comfort, a hug, a pat on the back, holding a child's hand, gently rocking them, or even physical proximity. I'm going to sit right here and I'm going to make sure that I'm here if you need me. maintaining a calm and regulated presence by speaking softly and calmly when possible, guiding through emotions and helping children name them and problem solving together. We know that dysregulation is contagious. So if you've ever been around somebody who's dysregulated, Daniel Siegel uses this analogy of a flipped lid. When one person's lid is flipped, what do you think happens to this lid? Boop, right? We have mirror neurons. We're not separate. Right? If you live with someone, you notice that you take on their mannerisms or you even start looking like one another. Like it's really bizarre. We are connected through our mirror neurons. So when one person flips their lid, our kids flip their lid, we have to work really hard to keep our lid down to help lower distress in this brain. And of course, the lid is the prefrontal cortex that develops later on in life. They're now saying the age is 25. And when the lid flips, we're operating from just an emotional, irrational part of the brain that helps us survive, right? This is fight, flight, freeze. So this lid flip analogy is one of my favorites to use. So we help soothe kids. Right here's a hug. I'm going to stand by and let's bring our lids down. Soothed might sound like this. You're okay. You will be okay. I will help you. I'm here for you. I'm going to add more in now that I'm talking out loud. And, you know, the behavior you're exhibiting might be challenging, but you're not bad. I still love you, even if I didn't love what you just did, right? And here's another important piece. As a parent, I'm okay. Even when I'm upset or struggling, I acknowledge it, right? We're not perfect as parents. I'll be the first one to say, parenting is really hard. So we can say something like, or exude this energy of, you're right, I am struggling. Kids are so perceptive. They know when caregivers are struggling, right? You're right, I am struggling, but I will be okay. After a good night's sleep, a walk, or a chat with a friend, I'll regain my strength. With the right support, I can handle whatever comes my way. And here's the important part. Many caregivers face challenges that prevent them from feeling or being okay. These struggles often stem from societal structures that fail to provide adequate support for families' mental health and emotional well-being. So acknowledging these barriers is essential to understand why caregivers may struggle to model okayness for their children. Questions, comments, feedback. If you have anything, feel free to pop in. Seen, safe, soothed, secure. So to feel secure is the ultimate outcome of being consistently seen, safe, and soothed around caregivers. So security is the foundation of a secure attachment, which develops when a child trusts that their caregiver will reliably meet their physical, emotional, and relational needs. This sense of security allows the child to explore their world with confidence, knowing they have a dependable source of support to return to when they encounter challenges. Let me just see where I am here. Okay. Okay, so everyone's listening to seen, safe, soothed, secure, and then wondering, well, life isn't perfect, right? And parents are not perfect. Caregivers are not perfect. So positive parenting is not perfect parenting. Positive parenting is like creating a quilt. And that's why I chose this adorable little stock image of this little person on a quilt. Positive parenting is like creating a quilt with each square representing moments and interactions with children. Most of the time, you want those squares to reflect emotional stability. These are the foundational pieces that make your quilt strong and comforting. But there will be inevitably squares that show up differently, where parents or caregivers can show up themselves as scared, not knowing what to do in a situation, scary, or emotionally unavailable. These moments can feel like mistakes, but they are only part of a larger picture. The beauty of the quilt isn't in its perfection, but in the way it holds together over time. When the majority of squares reflect safety, care, and engagement, the occasional difficult ones are softened by the overall pattern. What matters most is the effort to repair and keep sewing over time. So, recap. Emotional safety includes emotional attunement, having caregivers who seek to understand what emotions you are experiencing and help you through them, appropriate physical love and affection, warmth, care, and unconditional love, even when behaviors are tricky, comfort and reassurance, having caregivers who soothe and reassure during moments of distress, and okay, Katerina, thank you for calling out. Is there a 5S? Did I miss it? No, there are 4 S's. So that's why I never send out the PowerPoint before our presentation, because I always catch something and I have to change it. So thank you for pointing that out. It was bothering me as I was doing this. So thank you. Okay, so that's a recap of what emotional safety includes. So it's all about positive relational engagement. And the key word is engagement. Relationship is a game of send and receive. And that's why I use a tennis analogy, that it's a million interactions where a young person and their caregiver will have a game of send and receive. We are now going to talk about the still face experiment. And the reason is because I have never been to a social work training on relational trauma, which is essentially what we're talking about, where they haven't shown the still face experiment. So can folks pop into the chat and let me know if you've seen it or not, or if you're even familiar with it or not. So the still face experiment, okay, yes, it's very popular. Some folks aren't familiar. Okay, we're going to go over what the still face experiment is. It's a landmark study in developmental psychology conducted by Dr. Edward Tronick in the 1970s. It demonstrates the critical importance of emotional attunement between caregivers and infants for healthy emotional and social development. And again, it's shown in like every social work training I've been to. I am not going to show it to you, and this is why. I find the experiment distressing to watch because what it includes is, here's a little picture. I don't know if you can see my mouse, but I'm toggling it over. Okay, so there is a mom or a caregiver interacting with her baby. Now, her baby looks like they are about a year old, I would say, give or take. And in the experiment, the caregiver is smiling, pointing. The little person is engaging back, laughing, right? If you've hung out with a 1-year-old, you literally have conversations, and even younger, right? Where you're cooing at each other. So the mom and the baby are interacting with one another. Then in part 2 of the experiment, the mom engages in what's known as a still face. So she erases any form of engagement from her face. And the baby tries to re-engage, pointing, like I was just pointing over there. Are you going to look at what I'm pointing at? Right? And upping the ante. So being louder, interacting in a more boisterous way, right? Come on, mom, I really want your attention again. And then what's really hard to watch is that the baby goes into distress, right? Crying, arching its back. And then eventually the baby gives up and just goes, I'm not gonna engage, right? And again, the trauma of omission can be subconscious. A baby doesn't say, I'm not gonna engage with you anymore. It's a subconscious process of, okay, well, the pointing isn't working, the crying, the back arching isn't working. So instead, I'm going to withdraw. So again, it's hard to watch. If you feel resourced enough and it's something you're curious about, you can find it on YouTube. But the good news is there's a reunion phase. And in the reunion phase, the mom moves away from the still face and starts to re-engage again. And the infant, is a little cautious at first, but then, okay, mama, we've done this a million times before. I'm going to start pointing again. I'm going to start smiling again. And that game of tennis re-engages. So in the reunion phase, infants show relief, but it again can take some time to fully re-engage depending on the extent of the distress. The distress and withdrawal is the trauma. So withdrawal is a self-protective response when an infant's attempt at re-engagement fails. If unresponsiveness becomes chronic, it leads to the trauma of omission. And again, what we're talking about in our webinar today is the trauma of trauma of what didn't happen, right? So engagement and connection. This can create a negative psychological pattern like, I need to shut down, I'm alone in the world, I need big feelings, the crying, the back arching to get attention. And again, this is subconscious. These are ways that we learn to interact with the world based on the way that we were interacted with. And I want to just look in the chat. I have a question. Have there been any follow-up studies that you know of that show long-term effects of participating in the still face experiment? That's a great question. I'm going to go ahead and render a guess that there are no long-term outcomes of the still face experiment because the breach in connection is so short, right? We're talking like a minute where someone set a timer for 1 minute and said, okay, mom, don't give me any interaction, right? And in many ways, we all still face our loved ones from time to time, right? So you wake up in the morning and, your little person is ready to go and you need a moment before you open your eyes and they're trying to get your attention, right? Like micro little moments. So the idea isn't that, you have your still face for years and years. It's those tiny interactions that matter in the quilt. Is there a link? I'm going to answer a question in the chat. Is there a link between people who tend to run away in relationship where conflict occurs as a result of trauma? Yeah, we can definitely talk about that. So we're going to be talking about an attachment style known as avoidant attachment style. So conflict requires us to sit in our distress and say, let's talk through this. I know relationships require some work, and I have trust that we can work through this together. I can tolerate the emotions of not agreeing with you or, having to explain myself or working through something. So I would say that sometimes there is a link with avoidance and avoidance patterns and not having perhaps someone that we could go to when we were growing up that showed us that we can actually work through conflict together. And we'll talk actually about that later on. So that's a really great question, Habiba. Thank you. The trauma of omission exists on a spectrum, with the extreme end resembling the still face experiment, where a caregiver's complete emotional unresponsiveness leaves the child in distress and ultimately in withdrawal. Okay. More moderate examples include caregivers who are intermittently disengaged due to mental health struggles, stress, or addiction. Everyday moments like frequent smartphone use or overwork also contribute to subtle omissions where a child's attempts to connect are met with distraction or inconsistency. While occasional lapses are normal, chronic or repeated unresponsiveness can lead to feelings of invisibility and the development of unhealthy coping mechanisms like shutting down emotionally or acting out in order to get attention. Okay. So key findings of the still face experiment: emotional attunement is critical. The impact of prolonged responsiveness, the importance of repair and not perfection. And for the purposes of our webinar together, the still face experiences exist on a continuum. Any questions, comments before we move on? Okay. There are a few other developmental needs that I've added in because once again, we're talking about what is missing and how that can be traumatic sometimes. So here are a few more pieces. So a sense of belonging within a family, feeling wanted, included, and valued within your family. So if folks have seen The Help, there's always a line that stands out to me when Mae Mobley, the caregiver of, Aibileen is the caregiver to Mae Mobley, and she says to Mae Mobley, you is kind, you is smart, you is important. If anyone remembers that line, it's just always really stuck with me, right? Letting little people know with your words and your actions, right? You belong here. I value you. So a sense of belonging, autonomy and independence, being allowed to explore and develop a sense of self while knowing support is available should I need it. Having a healthy structure and routine. So learning the appropriate limits and rules. So kids don't like rules or structure, and yet they thrive within it. Healthy structure is not rigid, it's flexible, but it's a container that helps young people with predictability. Now, if you're engaged in parenting, or you know about parenting, this can be really hard, right? To set boundaries or enforce them on a regular basis takes a lot of self-resourcing to do that. Another developmental need is having healthy boundaries between family members. And I mean that in two ways. The first way is a boundary between I am not you, child, and you are not me. So I need to get to know you and value your individuality. And I can do that while being in connection with you. But ultimately, I need to be curious about who you are. I can't tell you who you are. I can guide you, but I can't mold you into what I want you to be. So boundaries in terms of respecting individuality, but also children not taking on adult responsibility or emotions. And this is a phenomenon known as parentification, right? So oftentimes when parents don't have support for many, many reasons, they can go to a young person and talk about things that can make little people feel perhaps not as secure, like financial troubles or conflict in a relationship. So maintaining healthy boundaries between family members can be really important. And guidance, receiving appropriate mentoring to navigating life's challenges and decisions. Ideally, a role of a caregiver is to model life skills to children. And there are two specific ones that I see a lot in my practice. So as a trauma therapist, there seems to be, I don't know, is it like a controversy in the field? Like, we're not teaching skills, but we are teaching many skills. So for example, healthy conflict resolution, demonstrating how to address disagreements constructively and with empathy, showing that conflict can lead to growth rather than fear or avoidance, right? Modeling that we can work through conflict and building healthy relationships, modeling positive interactions in romantic partnerships, friendships, workplace dynamics, and community engagement helps children understand the principles of mutual respect, communication, and trust. And I describe this process as skill building because there really is a kind of formula at play. We can learn how to communicate our needs and set boundaries, how to engage in emotional regulation when our bodies are dysregulated, and how to manage stress, how to navigate relationships with care, authenticity, and understanding. So when children lack these models, they may struggle to develop these skills independently, leading to challenges later on in adulthood. Now, again, there is always hope, right? That if we didn't learn these skills in childhood, there are opportunities to learn them later on through life. So we call them conflict resolution and social skills for a reason. Okay. We can't talk about the trauma of omission without addressing attachment, which shapes how individuals relate to themselves and others based on early childhood experiences. When a child's attachment needs, such as safety, emotional connection, and consistent care, are unmet, this omission impacts their emotional and psychological development. So a secure attachment is created when caregivers respond consistently and sensitively, helping children feel safe, valued, and worthy of love. So once again, the 4 S's in action. And the relational dance that fosters secure attachment can be seen in the model of the circle of security developed by Cooper, Hoffman, and Powell in the 1990s. And this circle of security model is drawing from the work of John Bowlby and Mary Ainsworth, the founders of attachment theory. So that's all very technical. I just want you to have the information. And now I'm going to present it in a way that might be a little bit more easy to understand. Okay. Are folks familiar with the circle of security? Mhm. Okay. Yes. Okay. So some folks are, some folks aren't. Again, I like to revisit this concept on a regular basis in my practice. I find, every time I return to it, I ground myself in this understanding. So hopefully you'll find it useful if you are familiar with it already. So the circle of security starts where a parent or a caregiver, right? Because not everyone is cared for by a parent, a caregiver is a secure base for a child. So I'm going to take care of you, nurture you, teach you about yourself as smart, kind, curious, and encourage independent play and exploration. So I'm a base from which you launch. So if you start at the top left-hand corner, right? Off you go, explore the world. You're kind and smart. Of course you can do it. Encouraging that independence. And then the little person will go out into the world and they need you to, just like that little girl, support my exploration, watch over me, delight in me, help me, enjoy with me. And then what happens in that circle is, if you need help or someone to talk to, come back to me because I am okay enough, like we talked about earlier. I can hold your emotions or worries and I can delight in you. Ultimately, that little person comes back and says, I need your help. Protect me, comfort me, delight in me, organize my feelings, or teach me what the heck these big feelings inside are. And then the caregiver becomes a safe haven. So a secure base from which to launch and a safe haven to which you can return. I'm going to soothe you. We can handle this together. You're doing so well. And ultimately, you're going to be okay to launch and explore again. So I really like this way to frame the attachment dance. And this can happen throughout the lifespan in terms of going to our primary attachment figures, which can be our, parents, but it can also be partners, friends. Teach me who I am as skilled and worthy of love and attention. And I go out in the world and I come back when I need some support. But through the circle of security in childhood, people can develop their schemas of themselves as able to deal with conflict and manage difficulty. So this sets a foundation. But it's not, once again, what word am I looking for here? Prescriptive, in that if young people didn't get this, their attachment style is this later on in life, and that's it. We know we have neuroplasticity, and we know that our brains continue to change and create new neural pathways throughout life. So that's the end of objective 1. Define the essential childhood experiences that contribute to positive mental health outcomes in adulthood. Let's take a breath together and reflect. Questions, comments, concerns? Is this information new? Have you thought about the trauma of omission in this way before? Is this reinforcing what you already knew? Okay, somebody said, give a couple of examples of the trauma of omission you have seen recently in your practice. I'm going to come back to that question, if that's okay. But I can offer, right. I think that's a sensitive question because I want to honor and make sure that I'm not sharing people's information. However, trauma of omission can include, for example, folks who grew up with parents who were very successful professionally. So lots of folks come to my practice with parents who are professionals, and who don't conceptualize their childhood experiences as necessarily traumatic, in that they had all of their basic needs met, and yet sometimes the parents were absent or unable to attune based on being preoccupied with other facets of life. So that's one example. For example, I see that a lot in my practice. And again, what we're talking about is hidden trauma. So folks coming to therapy and saying, what do you mean trauma, right? I had well-intentioned parents. I don't identify as having trauma. And yet we know that it can be impactful when we don't have our emotional engagement needs met. Someone said this is new and makes so much sense. It was the emotional loss. That's right. Okay, so I think we'll have continued conversations as we move through. So end of objective 1, define essential childhood experiences that contribute to positive mental health outcomes in adulthood. Okay, what is the difference between developmental behavior versus acting out? Sarah, that's a great question. So developmental behavior are behaviors that you would expect a young person to exhibit. You would expect a young person to be messy, disorganized, have no emotional regulation. Acting out is when those needs aren't being met and can run wild, for example. So I worked in residential care, in a residential treatment facility for young people who couldn't be accommodated at foster homes because of really big behaviors. And these little people who were 10, 11, 12 years old would take all of the books off their bookshelf and throw them to the ground and absolutely trash a room and cry and scream. And my job was to go into group home or foster home placements and to provide education for how to meet the relational needs of these little people who were acting out, feeling disconnected from their families of origin, feeling alone, etc. So acting out are really, really big feelings with no one available to meet those needs and to provide education for what is happening inside. So I hope I can go into much more detail about that, but I think that's maybe a little bit outside of our talk and also going through the rest of the material. Amazing question, Olivia. What is the difference between complex trauma and the trauma of omission? So the trauma of omission can sometimes lead to complex trauma. Complex trauma is a form of trauma. We're going to talk about this in detail in webinar 2, where trauma happens in a closed system. So you can't just leave. And when you can't leave a system, you have to develop coping strategies to be able to deal with it. And when we develop coping strategies, sometimes we can create parts of our personality that, I'm going to save this for webinar 2. I'm going to talk about complex trauma in detail in webinar 2, just because it deserves its own webinar. It deserves its own time. But you're right, the trauma of omission is connected to complex trauma. Are there mental health disorders that can make a child more vulnerable to omission issues? Or can omission issues accelerate a pre-existing condition? I mean, are there mental health disorders that can make a child more vulnerable? Mental health disorders in adults, perhaps? Okay. So I think what that question is asking is, are there mental health disorders in adults that can make child more vulnerable to omission? I mean, when adults experience symptoms of depression, anxiety, or personality disorders like narcissism or borderline, it's really hard to meet our child's needs when we're feeling like I can't get out of bed or I don't know how to manage feelings of fear. So there are many expressions of mental health challenges that can contribute to the trauma of omission. And again, contribute to. Great questions. I hope I'm answering them in a way that's useful for you. Let's move on to objective number 2, the impact of trauma omission during childhood years on adult mental health, right? And again, we're talking about presentations where folks later on in life might not necessarily have a connection between symptoms that they're experiencing and how the trauma of omission might have contributed to those symptoms. When the relational dance lacks the 4 S's, it can lead to the development of different insecure attachment styles. So a note that attachment styles are not fixed and can vary based on circumstances. Apologies, I've gone over this slideshow like hundreds of times, and yet I still miss spelling sometimes. So thank you. The people involved so a note that attachment styles are not fixed and can vary based on circumstances, the people involved, and continued life experiences. Our brains evolve and change throughout our lifespan because we know we have neuroplasticity. So anxious attachment can present later on in life as fear of abandonment, constantly seeking reassurance, big emotions, right? It's the adult expression of the arching of the back or the crying out for help. So folks can ask for a lot. Sometimes they will say, I'm exhausted from the amount of energy that I'm expending, or I feel exhausted by somebody in my life who never believes that I care for them. And this can sometimes become a self-fulfilling prophecy. And what's really interesting is the subconscious way our brain works sometimes is, I'm going to play out this scenario in a way that's familiar. I'm going to push you away subconsciously so that you don't have to abandon me, because I'm going to make you abandon me in a way so that at least I know what to expect. And again, like the hand on the hot stove, that's not something conscious. That's something that can happen in the background. Anxious attachment can also look like difficulty trusting when things are good. And a lot of clients, so again, this is going back to somebody's question, will show up in therapy as detectives. They have these detective parts. And I'm happy to point out to folks, it looks like your detective is trying to find out more information to help keep you safe. And again, this is my colleague Brooke had mentioned. That was her contribution, detectives trying to find evidence to support abandonment. So that was a fruitful conversation that we had when going over this presentation together. Another form of insecure attachment is avoidant attachment. So fear of abandonment, fear of vulnerability, right? I'm not going to try. No hurt. It can be subconscious. If I don't try, you can't hurt me. Right? Again, hand on the hot stove, it's subconscious. Suppressing emotions. I'm going to be disengaged. I'm going to ask for nothing from you because what's the point? I can point and, laugh and you won't look anyway. So this can show up sometimes as hyper independence. And if there are therapists on the call, you might have clients like this who will not ask for help, don't need anybody, and yet are at therapy. So there's a part that wants to, engage or look at what's underneath. And then we have disorganized attachment, difficulty regulating emotions within relationships, high levels of emotional intensity and unpredictability, really intense struggles with trust, conflict resolution, and maintaining a sense of safety. Here are some coping mechanisms in response to not having relational needs met. So there can be challenges in self-esteem and self-worth. So I learn about myself as either lovable or not based on how I was related to within my family of origin. And you might even notice this as an adult. If you meet up with someone and every time you meet up with them, they're smiling and laughing and, sneeze slapping, like you're so wonderful to hang out with, you're going to grow a little taller and consider yourself as, oh, I might be, fun to hang out with or funny or enjoyable to be around. And that's how our sense of self gets created through relationships. Once again, we're born not knowing whether we're a lamp or not. So the way we're engaged with, the language we're given is so important. Coping mechanisms in response to not having relational needs met can also include that suppression of emotional expression, believing there's no point, I don't want to burden others and ask for help, or not even having awareness of what's happening inside, what I'm thinking or feeling, and what I want and need. So oftentimes in therapy, sometimes, a client might not know, what do I want? What do I want? What job do I want? Or what do I even want to eat tonight? Or who do I want to hang out with? Do I actually like this person? Or does this person just like me? Right? So when we ask young people questions and develop that sense of curiosity, they get to know themselves and they get to learn how to express themselves. Another coping mechanism is a fear of vulnerability. avoiding open communication to protect oneself from rejection or judgment. This can lead to passive aggressiveness or withholding feelings. Fear of rejection can also manifest as jealousy, controlling behavior, or pushing partners away preemptively to reenact a familiar scenario. Difficulty building trust, right? Just that schema of other people is they're unreliable or unsafe. Hypervigilant to others' needs and emotions. So it's scanning for a threat of disconnection, finding it difficulty to connect with others because we're constantly thinking about others' needs. Sorry, I said owns needs. I meant others' needs. And adopting perfectionistic or people-pleasing tendencies to earn love. So if folks have had the experience of earning love through pleasing other people or being hyper attuned to other people's needs, these can all be clues about the trauma of omission. And once again, clues. We wouldn't know this unless we engaged in a fulsome conversation and a fulsome assessment, but these could be clues. Childhood coping mechanisms can extend into adulthood. When a parent shows up as scared or scary, or in the case of our presentation, emotionally absent, children often think it must be me. Children, by definition, are egocentric. So when caregivers are inconsistent or struggling, children can sometimes internalize the blame, believing that they're the problem, or they engage in magical thinking that they can contribute to the solution. So for example, if I'm tidy enough, if I don't make my parents mad, right, I can make this different or better. This gives little people a false sense of control, which feels safer than actually accepting helplessness, right? Remember, kids can't just go live across with a family across the street. So in order to find resilience within a family of origin where things are not going well, little people have really creative ways of creating coping mechanisms in their brains that are useful for that scenario, but can extend later on in life and not be useful later on in life. Again, self-doubt, over-responsibility in relationships, fear of vulnerability, etc. So once again, many people come to therapy presenting with challenges like anxiety, depression, difficulties in relationships, a general sense of unfulfillment. When asked about childhood, they often dismiss it as, fine or nothing remarkable. They might describe parents as good people or, they really did their best. However, through deeper exploration, we often uncover the trauma of omission, emotional needs that weren't met in childhood. And what makes it particularly insidious is that it can often go unnoticed or unacknowledged. Unlike visible acts of harm, the absence of care is invisible, subtle, and pervasive. So folks can end up feeling a sense of emptiness without understanding why. Or many folks might have heard, you're too sensitive for feeling hurt if you talk to caregivers about this. You're too sensitive, you're exaggerating, for folks who intergenerationally were just surviving. It's like, you have food on the table, you have a roof over your head. Some families don't even conceptualize, like, what the heck are you talking about emotional needs, right? The unspoken nature of the trauma of omission also means individuals can grow up feeling confused about their struggles, right? They can internalize, I didn't experience anything terrible, so why am I struggling so much? And this lack of validation can sometimes make the pain worse. And of objective 2, discussing the impacts of the trauma of omission on adult mental health. Questions or comments? Would love to hear from you. Okay. As someone had said, I now understand the trauma of omission. Wonderful. I'm happy to help. Objective number 3. And again, feel free to pop in at any time, not just when I'm asking a question, because your feedback is so valuable. Objective number 3, normalize why the trauma of omission is so common. The trauma of omission is so common because it often stems from systemic and cultural norms rather than intentional neglect. So often the harm is not intentional. From my experience as a therapist, the trauma of omission comes often from parents who love their children and have good intentions. For many, acknowledging unmet needs can feel like parent blaming. It can be uncomfortable to confront these truths, particularly since many parents are doing their best within their own limitations, right? So folks don't want to, feel like they're bad-mouthing or not honoring how hard parenting is and what a lot of parents have been through, but it's not about parent blaming. It's actually to highlight a society that doesn't provide the skills and environment for folks to engage in healthy parenting often. So that's the third objective we'll go through. Has anybody read The Myth of Normal? Yeah, okay. Okay. Awesome, Hillary, Christina, wonderful. I mean, I'm such a Gabor Mate fan. I think he explains things in such an amazing, thoughtful way. And he wrote a book called The Myth of Normal in the last few years. And it really talks about how our society creates the circumstances in which the trauma of omission is pervasive. So we live in a capitalist system. Economic growth relies on increased production and consumption. Productivity is celebrated as a driver of progress, innovation, and wealth accumulation, reinforcing the belief that more is better. This dynamic fuels this hustle culture where people are encouraged to constantly work harder, achieve more, and monetize every aspect of their lives. This may be especially true for second-generation Canadians who had the unique pressure to do better economically than their parents who moved here for a better life, right? We're a country of immigrants. Many of our parents came here to give us a better life. And what does that mean? Oftentimes that means financial stability, educational opportunities. And I had credited Brooke again for a very fruitful conversation that we had around that topic and for adding that into this chat. So the American dream, for example, equates success with this relentless effort and the ability, if you just work hard enough, you can pull yourself up by your bootstraps. Okay, so Kate had said the best part of The Myth of Normal is reading Gabor's own experiences as an infant separated from his mom for some months, right? I'm sure lots of folks have the experience of looking back on their generational patterning and looking at where were their disruptions. And you don't have to go too far up to look at displacement, to look at, I don't want to trigger folks, so I'm not going to get into it. I wonder about the trauma of omission that occurs when parents are not given the emotional skills they need, so they pass this hurt on to their kids. Absolutely. Yeah, not only capitalism, but Hollywood perpetuates these so-called norms. Right. Okay. So work as coping. Productivity often offers a sense of control in an unpredictable world. By focusing on measurable achievements, individuals can feel like they're mastering their environment and reducing uncertainty, even if it's temporary. So there's a photo of wildfires there, right? So much in life is unpredictable. As a newer parent, parenting is unpredictable. I'll be the first person to say work is structured. I know no one's going to throw something at me, right? Or I seriously hope not at work. It can feel like we're in control, and especially when we're given that notion that more is more, right? So we really have to think about, is capitalism a system in which, or this type of capitalism a system in which, we can unabsorb ourselves from this constant need for more, and focus on what actually makes us happy, which is connection. Identity is often tied to work, right? We can ask the question, you're at a party, what's the first thing we ask? What do you do, right? And a comment that's so wonderful, parents can't give their kids what they don't have. Absolutely. So again, often parents find it more straightforward to focus on external markers of success, career achievement, financial stability, academic performance. All of those have markers and metrics. This feels more concrete than emotional presence. And many of us have lost even our ability to be present. Right? Think of COVID. We're all online 24/7 or meant to be available to folks 24/7. We have to actually focus on creating room for slower, less tangible work like connecting and meeting the needs of our children, but also our partners, our friends, our parents, etc. I think it's fair to say we live in a society obsessed with wealth and productivity. I don't feel too, controversial saying that. Um, yeah, text messages instead of face to face is ruining communication skills. Yeah, absolutely. So fixation sidelines relationships and well-being, fostering isolation, shallow interaction. And, there's a reason for this. Consumption promises to bring us joy, right? But it doesn't. You will be happy if you buy this, right? And I have a shattering mirror because if folks have seen the show Black Mirror, right, it really highlights these twisted ways that society, focuses on competition and wealth. And okay, this is a really important part. Caregivers themselves are stressed and busy, right? So I live in Toronto. The cost of living is just skyrocketing here. Balancing work, household responsibilities, societal expectations. Lots of parents are just overstretched and unable to consistently meet emotional needs, right? Like we're just trying to survive sometimes. Get our kids fed and where they need to be and make rent. And so I totally can understand, and this picture just highlights it so beautifully, that yeah, stressed parents can't always attune, right? It's harder to attune when we're stressed. I have to be careful of my language. Remember that the circle of security starts with I'm okay enough to handle whatever it is that you may need me for. But what if parents aren't okay enough? Then what happens? There's a lack of support for new parents. New parents often face overwhelming challenges with little to no support, leaving them isolated during the most vulnerable times of their lives. So while Canadian parents may qualify for up to a year of parental leave, the support often falls short where it matters most. New parents typically are discharged from the hospital within 24 hours after giving birth, leaving them to navigate the challenges of recovery and newborn care largely on their own if they don't have family supports or the resources to engage private supports. Without adequate community, family, or systemic support, new parents are left to navigate exhaustion, identity shifts, mental health struggles, perpetual feelings of inadequacy, and burnout. I don't think this is a controversial issue. Postpartum resources and guidance are limited for many folks. In Canada, certainly in the US, where there is essentially no parental leave or so many workplaces, even in a country that does have parental leave, lack the flexibility needed to support parents, leaving them to balance the demands of work and family with minimal accommodation. There's also identity shifts. We're not going to get into it in this lecture, but there is conflicting information about pieces like sleep training. Like there are prescriptive perspectives about when to actually pick your baby up when they're crying. And this I will say is super controversial, right? And I think everyone has to do what's best for them. But I will say in the myth of normal, Dr. Mate does talk about how society has erred too far in allowing babies and infants to learn to self-soothe when babies really can't self-soothe. They need caregivers to pick them up and care for them, right? So I think every family has to do what's best for them and consider how the cultural context cultural context can influence if somebody's telling you the best thing you can do for your baby is to let them cry for an hour without picking them up. Of course, you're going to listen to expert advice. And the same with Gabor Mate. He talked about as an infant being separated from his mom and not being allowed to be fed except for every 4 hours, like literally not being allowed to be fed. So, these are heartbreaking. These are heartbreaking recommendations. And that's why postpartum support is so important to figuring out what is best for you and your family. Our society also copes through addiction. I don't think this is controversial to say that our society copes with the difficulty of disconnection, feeling like we don't measure up through addiction. So again, in the realm of Hungry Ghosts, Dr. Mate explores the prevalence of addiction as a symptom of society that's disconnected from emotional well-being. He argues addiction arises not from a moral failure, but from unmet emotional needs and trauma. So our culture obsessed with productivity, materialism, and external success leaves many feeling empty and seeking solace in substances. Substances are just one addiction. Addiction can be anything that relieves pain or suffering in the moment, but that causes long-term harm. So that can be phone addiction, that can be substance addiction, that can be any behavioral types of addiction. If I do this thing, I'll feel okay, but it's causing me harm. Addiction is a barrier to attunement as a parent. If I can't manage my internal experience, if I am needing to engage in a behavior to feel okay, I may not have the space to attune and have curiosity for a little person. Intergenerational trauma. Many caregivers grew up in environments where their own emotional needs were unmet due to neglect, abuse, or systemic factors like poverty, racism, war, and colonization. So if you never got something because your caregivers' environments were so unhealthy that they couldn't give it to you, it can be challenging to give it to your children. Not impossible, but you might have to learn how. Unresolved trauma can surface as emotional unavailability, heightened reactivity, or difficulty creating a safe environment, unintentionally passing on these patterns to the next generation. So next webinar, we'll talk about ways to break generational patterns and provide hope that there are ways to break generational patterns. Many folks have emotional blind spots, again, focusing on physical care, unintentionally neglecting the emotional world of a child. Yeah, we reenact patterns. There's a fear of vulnerability, etc. So I do want to leave a few moments for questions, and we are like right on time, which is amazing. So Celine asked a question, how do you use EMDR and how does this help clients? We're going to talk about that in workshop 2. For folks who have read this book called The Body Keeps the Score, it's a groundbreaking book that was released in 2014 by Bessel van der Kolk. He highlights several interventions to respond to trauma, including complex trauma and the trauma of omission. So we'll be talking about EMDR, ego state therapy, IFS. If these are all like acronyms that mean nothing to you, don't worry, we'll go over them. How do you assess for the trauma of omission? We're also going to talk about that in workshop 2. But in workshop 2, we'll talk about, okay, I want to go over this. So interventions to address relational wounding, how to reparent parts of the self that experience unmet needs, how to heal even if caregivers aren't ready to have conversation, because many caregivers can become defensive naturally, how to continue in relationship with caregivers who couldn't meet the needs, etc. Yeah, so we're going to cover a lot and it's still a work in progress. So if you have a piece that you're interested in, please feel free to email me. Katrina asked for resources, books, podcasts. Well, I thought you'd never ask. So these are some wonderful resources. When I'm working with clients on trauma and the trauma of omission, I always recommend Judith Herman's just incredible book, The Trauma and Recovery. And she talks a lot about how trauma occurs in societal structures. She's a feminist and she talks about violence against women, racism, oppression, colonization. So if you want to understand the trauma of omission in context, that's an amazing book. The Whole Brain Child is a wonderful parenting book that I read in my early 20s when I was very far from being a parent, and I find it just an amazing way of conceptualizing children's needs and how the brain grows and develops. So even if you're not a parent, this book is like incredible to learning about the trauma what emotional needs are and how to meet them in kids. So have a look at this. Have a look at the bibliography that will be included in your slideshow. If I missed any resources you really like, let me know. If you have any questions or comments, my email is info@fullpotentialtherapy.ca. Again, thank you to my colleague for helping me go over this. If you have any questions about where to seek out support, let me know. I can see if I can refer you to appropriate services. If you want to keep updated about workshops like these, you can subscribe to our newsletter using the link below.